Hey class online, Pastor John here. So excited to continue this series talking about the men and women of the Bible. Today we come to a man in the Bible that doesn't get very much attention. He's kind of like a middle kid when it comes to the patriarchs of the Old Testament. And we're going to talk about Isaac. The reason I say he's like a middle kid is because in most families how it goes is the oldest, the one who comes first, might be the trailblazer. They might be the people that come up with all the ideas that all the rest of the siblings follow. And usually what happens is the youngest sibling ends up being the center of attention, ends up being the person who gets a lot of attention. And it's funny, that's kind of how it goes here when it comes to the patriarchs. Now I know that Isaac is not actually a middle kid, but he falls in between two massively important characters. He falls between Abraham and Jacob. And it's funny that in the very chapter that Abraham dies, we find out about Jacob and Esau, the next ones. And Isaac gets not very much love. So we're going to look at the story of Isaac. What can we learn from Isaac? And when we talk about Isaac, what do you think of? When you think of the character Isaac in the Bible, what do you think of? What is he famous for? And how do you identify with Isaac? Well, we want to cover all of that right here at Class Online. So make sure you grab a Bible and let's open it up. And we want to start not just with Isaac's birth, but what happens before his birth, because that's really important. So grab a Bible, turn open to Genesis chapter 12. Genesis 12. Now we covered a bit about Abraham last week, but it's funny, I said Isaac doesn't get very much attention in Hebrews chapter 11, that passage about the hall of faith. You know how many verses Isaac gets? Abraham gets like 12 or 13, something like that. You know how many verses Isaac gets? He gets 1. And it's funny that we're going to find out what he's famous for is not being very famous. But let's check this out. We're in Genesis. Genesis chapter 12, the first thing we want to look at is the background to his life. And the background of Isaac's life really starts with the promise that God makes to Abraham. Abraham gets these promises from God in Genesis 12, reiterated again in Genesis 15, and again in 22. But this first promise in Genesis 12 talks about this promise of a nation. Check this out. This is Genesis 12, verse 1. It says, "Now the Lord God said to Abram, go from your country and from your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." Now, at this point in Abraham's life, he's not even called Abraham, he's really called Abram. He has no kids, but he's living in a nice area, a nice place, probably with his house that he's lived in for years, probably with his retirement fund all stored up, and he's good to go for life. God calls him out of that situation, as we learned last week that Greg taught us how God called him out to go to a land of promise that he had never been before, maybe never even heard of, and he goes to live there in tents for the rest of his life. So I don't know if that's the kind of retirement that you are thinking about taking. Probably wasn't the retirement Abram was thinking of, but it's what God called him to. And the reason this is important for Isaac is because this ends up being the background and the setting for his birth. You've got this older couple, probably in their 60s, 70s at this point, who have no kids. God says, I'm going to make a nation out of you. How is that going to work? Well, he goes on, Genesis chapter 15, verse 4. You might be thinking, like Abram was thinking, well, how is this going to work? How am I going to have a big nation? How is God going to fulfill these promises if I don't have a son? That's exactly what Abram asked in verse 3. This is Genesis 15:3. It says, "And Abram said, Behold, you've given me no offspring, and a member of my household will be my heir." And member of my household means one of his slaves. Maybe this guy named Eleazar. We're not sure who he's thinking of, but he's thinking someone in my house is going to be the heir to my stuff. It's not going to be my kid. And here's what God says in verse 4. "And behold, the word of the Lord came to him. This man shall not be your heir. Your very own son shall be your heir." So, right there in Genesis 15, it's promised again that Abram and Sarai are going to have a son. They're going to have someone to pass on these promises to. And we're going to find out more. Check out Genesis 17, verse 16. Genesis 17:16. This is when these angels show up and they start talking to Abram and Sarai, and they're called Abraham and Sarah at this point. It says, "And God said to Abraham," this is in verse 15, "As for Sarai, your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but you should call her name Sarah, and I will bless her. And moreover, I will give you a son by her." Couldn't be clearer. Abraham, Sarah, they're going to have a son. They're old at this point. It says, I'll bless her, and she shall become nations. Kings and peoples shall come from her. And Abraham fell on his face and laughed. I don't know what you want to do. If an angel comes to you and starts talking to you about a promise God's making, I don't know if you'd fall on your face and laugh, but that's what Abraham did. You might say, well, why is he laughing? It says, shall a child be born to a man that's 100 years old? Shall Sarah, who's 90 years old, bear a child? A little crazy for God to fulfill this promise through Abraham and Sarah. It makes sense that God would do it some other way maybe, but God says no. It's going to happen through Abraham and Sarah. They're going to have a child to pass on all of these promises to. So that happens in chapter 17. We haven't even got to Isaac yet. He's not even born yet. Check out chapter 18, though. It continues. The promises that there's so much buildup here. And you might have heard this before. I think we talked about this last week. But Abraham and Sarah were promised a child, and they didn't get this child for like 15 years. It was a long period of time of waiting. It might have even been more than 15 years that they've been waiting for this son to come and doesn't come. But check out verse 12. This is Genesis 18:12. Now, we've got this situation where it's like last time. We got a messenger from God talking to Abraham. Sarah laughed to herself when she heard that she was going to have a son. She says, I'm worn out, and my Lord is old. Shall I have pleasure? The Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh? Shall I indeed bear a child now that I'm old? She's asking that question. Is anything too hard for the Lord? At the appointed time, I will return to you about this time next year, and Sarah shall have a son. But Sarah denied it, saying, I didn't laugh, for she was afraid. But he said, no, you did laugh. It's funny. She laughs and then she lies about laughing. And later on, we're going to see how in chapter 21, I know we're just doing a quick survey of this, but in chapter 21, Isaac is born. Finally, this promised child is born, and Sarah says, I did laugh, and he's going to be called Isaac because he makes everybody laugh. People will laugh. So it's okay for you to laugh at Sarah and Abraham for having a baby at old age because they give us permission right here. Chapter 21, verse 6 says, Sarah said, God has made laughter for me, and everyone who hears will laugh over me. And she said, who would have said that Abraham and Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. All of this buildup to Isaac's birth shows us that God is keeping his promises to Abraham. So it's funny, none of this is about Isaac. You see that? All of this is like circumstantial stuff that's all around Isaac's life, but it's nothing that Isaac is doing. He's just this child of promise. And then what goes on in chapter 22 is that famous and really scary section of the Bible where Abraham almost sacrifices his son in obedience to the Lord. And Isaac, the heir, the promise, the only son that's legitimate, almost dies. But God keeps that from happening because God had a promise all along to point towards Christ through all this. But we see all of this play out. Do you notice we've not talked about anything Isaac has done? It's because Isaac, later on in these verses, in these chapters, he's really known for just being a quiet, submissive servant. Really, in Genesis 22, he doesn't fight his father where he probably could have. His father's old. He was a young man, maybe in his teenage years. He probably could have fought Abraham, but he didn't. He sat there and was willing to be sacrificed because God said so. Quiet, simple, submission, and obedience to God. That's what Isaac did. And then in chapter 24, after Sarah dies, Abraham sends a servant to go find a wife for him. I mean, really, put yourself in Isaac's shoes. His whole life is just given to him. All of his choices and his decisions, they're just kind of put in his lap, and he just has to go with what God gives him. It's interesting because Abraham we see as kind of the maverick, right? He's the first one. He goes out. Really, he's following God's plan, but there's so much adventure in his life. Jacob, the same way. Jacob usually gets himself in trouble by his maverick decisions, but Isaac is just kind of steady, simple, doing what God told him to do. That's what we see in chapter 24, this big, long chapter about how God sent this servant to go find a wife for Isaac. Isaac didn't complain. He's almost a 40-year-old man, doesn't have a wife yet, but God calls this girl, Rebecca, to be his wife, and he listens. Quiet, simple, submission to God's will. That happens in chapter 24. Then in chapter 25, Abraham dies, and guess who's born right away? Jacob and Esau. It's almost like Moses is skipping past Isaac. Why is he doing that? It's because Isaac is not the center of this story. Isaac is not the center of attention. He's a person that really is just called to pass on this promise to his sons who are more important than him. Specifically, Jacob's more important. Really, the only chapter in the Bible that's all about Isaac is Genesis 26. Genesis 26 talks about how God and Isaac have this conversation. There was a famine in the land. Isaac was going to go down to Egypt. God said, don't go down to Egypt. Stay in the promised land. Stay there because I have a plan for you in this land. So he obeyed God's voice. And then what happens? He has a run-in with Abimelech, one of the Canaanite leaders, which this is not the Abimelech that Abraham had a run-in with. This is another one. But you'll notice, this is repeated a lot in Genesis, these guys are lying about their wives. They're like, oh, my wife, they're not really my wife. It's just my relative, just my sister. I don't know why they did that so often. That seems like an inherited family sin or something. They always are doing that here. Abraham does it twice. Isaac does it. He follows his dad's sin. This is clearly not a shining moment for him. But in chapter 27 and 28, we start to move towards Jacob and Esau. Now, that's a quick overview of his life. But what can we learn? The first thing I already said, that we can learn simple submission to God's will through Isaac's life. He's not very famous. He doesn't do any amazing things. All he does is just tries to do what God has told him to do. He's just fulfilling all the promises that God made to Abraham. He's just carrying those on to the next generation. And really, his sons will end up being more influential and more important than him. But all he's doing is just being faithful to carry that along. You know, that might be how it feels sometimes for Christians. Maybe your life doesn't feel like it's very big or important or anything like that. But what you might be doing is a lot like what Isaac was doing, passing on God's promises. That's a huge thing. And when I say passing on, I'm not saying passing up on them and saying no to them. I'm saying taking God's promises and giving them to the next generation. That's really what Isaac is famous for. I said we're going to look at Hebrews 11. Hebrews 11, verse 20, that one solitary verse in Hebrews 11 that is referencing the faith of Isaac goes something like this. Hebrews 11. I'm getting there. I promise. I'm stalling for you. You're turning there too, right? Or you're looking it up, I'm sure. I don't know. Hebrews 11, verse 20 says, by faith, Isaac invoked future blessings on Jacob and Esau. And verse 21 goes to talk about Jacob. After all these verses about Abraham, here's what Isaac is famous for: passing on the promise. Taking God's promise that was given to Abraham, passing it on to his children, because he was an heir of that promise. If you ever look up Isaac in the Bible, you look up the name Isaac, you'll find some things in the New Testament where Paul specifically liked to use Isaac, the child of promise, as an example in the New Testament. One of the most famous places he does that is in the book of Galatians. In Galatians 3:29, it says that we who are Christians, we kind of fall in line like one of Abraham's offspring. So all of the descendants of Abraham kind of fall in this camp of being heirs of a promise, that God made a promise to Abraham that was going to affect all of his kids. Now, you might not be a biological Jew, but if you trust in Christ, you fall in line with a lot of the promises made to Abraham in the Old Testament, that all the nations of the earth will be blessed. All the families of the earth will be blessed. You are blessed because of the promise that God made to Abraham that Isaac carried on to his kids. That's amazing. And if you think about it like that, if Isaac doesn't pass this on, right, the world looks different. The Bible looks a lot different if Isaac is not faithful to do what God says. But in Galatians 3, it says we are like children of Abraham. We're like offspring of Abraham, and we get to share in the benefits of God's promise. Now, later on in Galatians chapter 4, verse 28, it starts to talk about what that promise looks like. That you and I share in a promise of a kingdom. I don't want to stretch this too far, but think about this. Paul makes this connection. He says Christians are a lot like Isaac. We're children of a promise. Think about it. If you trust in Jesus Christ, you are an inheritor, you're an heir of a promise that was made long before you were born. That you are one of the many people that fall in line and get the benefits of this promise. What's the promise? Well, I think the promise, the most important primary promise, is that God promised to give a kingdom to his son, Jesus Christ. That through the redemption that Jesus accomplished, he earned for himself the kingdom that God was giving. The kingdom talked about in Daniel 7. The kingdom talked about all throughout the Gospels. That kingdom is coming. And what Romans chapter 8 says, what Paul says in that verse, that chapter, is that all who trust in Christ and are children of God are fellow heirs with Christ. That really, Christ is like Isaac, right? We're not necessarily filling the Isaac role. We're filling like the mini Isaac roles. We come alongside Jesus, and Jesus gives us the kingdom. That Jesus earned this inheritance, and he graciously shares that with us, which is why in the book of Romans, Jesus is called our brother. You know, sometimes we talk about Jesus as like, oh, Jesus is like our spiritual father. Well, Romans says that he's actually our spiritual brother, that the Father is our spiritual father, and Jesus shares the inheritance with us. Theologically, that's how we ought to think about Jesus, that he earned this inheritance and gives it to us. 1 Peter chapter 1 talks about that too. 1 Peter 1:3 says that there is an inheritance that is kept in heaven for us. And because we are children of the promise, that promise made to Jesus, we get to fall in line under. We get the benefits of that too. That is amazing. And hopefully the story of Isaac will help you glory and think of and dwell in those promises of God. I mean, think about this. Isaac never got a kingdom when he was living on earth, right? Jacob never got a kingdom when he was living on earth. Abraham didn't either. And that's why Hebrews 11 says they looked forward and they saw this kingdom that God promised. He was an heir to no land, right? He was a child of a promise that wasn't realized. His whole family lived in tents, yet God said to them, you are going to be this big, amazing nation. Now, did God fulfill that promise? Absolutely. Is God still fulfilling that promise? Absolutely. But did they see it in their lifetime? They didn't. And I think that's where we can find some comfort from the story of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that were given these promises of a kingdom and a nation that they didn't get the benefits of living in while they were here on earth. But certainly now, they have seen those benefits, and they're living in God's kingdom, and they will live in God's perfect kingdom. You know, the amazing thing is you get to be a part of that too. I get to be a part of that too. We get to fall in line with these promises and receive all the blessing of these promises. That's an amazing thing. God is amazing at keeping his promises, and also he's so gracious to allow us to be a part of it. So when you think of Isaac, there's not that much that he does that's that amazing, but he is certainly a humble, submissive servant. He does what he's told to do, and he does it successfully. He's also a good reminder for us that we are heirs of a promise, that God made a promise to his son to give him a kingdom, and Jesus allows us to be part of that kingdom. He makes us co-heirs, fellow heirs with Christ, as Romans chapter 8 says. And also, one more thing, that it shows us, when we look at the life of Isaac, it should remind us that we need to be people who are passing on that promise. Isaac passed on the promise to Jacob, right? And in an evangelistic sense, you know, we pass on the promise of Jesus' kingdom too. And we want to be faithful in doing that. And really, that's the best legacy we could live, is that we passed on the gospel of Jesus. Ultimately, that's Isaac's legacy, that he passed on the promise of God's kingdom to his sons. Now, hopefully, that should encourage us to pass on the promise of Jesus' gospel to our world. So that's what we get from the life of Isaac. I know there wasn't much to it, but hopefully that will encourage you and I to live this week thinking about the amazing promises of God and remembering, thankfully, that we get to be a part of them and we can share them with others.